Thanks very much, Greg. I'll just share my screen, checking that everyone can see that. Great, thank you. And I echo Greg's acknowledgement to country and acknowledge that I'm on Gadigal land of people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging as well. So a little bit about myself before we get stuck in. I started my career in medical research before transitioning over to consulting just over 4 years ago. My scientific training has shaped the way that I think about approaching problems, developing hypotheses, and collecting evidence in order to make a robust judgment. This is no different to how I approach my role now as a consultant in the evaluation and review space. I work predominantly for government, research, and nonprofit clients, and mostly in the areas of science, R&D, and health. But I also dabble in a wide range of disciplines and skills. So with that background in mind, I wanted to talk you through some of the similarities and differences from my perspective between social impact measurement and evaluation. There are different schools of thought on these two ideas. Social impact measurement and evaluation are labels for different sets of communities, cultures, and attitudes. They involve work of different scale, resources, timeframes, and often use different techniques. So one of the questions I wanted to ask today is, are labels important? Does it matter what we call ourselves or our work? And where do our communities fit? So is evaluation a subset of social impact measurement? Is social impact measurement a subset of evaluation? Or are these two completely separate ideas? And if so, what are we doing here today? If we are one, why do we have different names? So from my perspective, both social impact measurement and evaluation involve critical thinking and inquiry. They involve testing assumptions and asking questions in order to seek a deeper understanding. And they both compile evidence to then assess and make a judgment about the effect of a program or policy. Both bring more accountability to the way that programs and organisations operate, and more broadly, how society operates. Another interesting point about social impact measurement and evaluation is that they are both discipline agnostic. So they can draw on the best of economics, pop philosophy, and environmental and social sciences. To me, social impact measurement is practical and applied. It involves more timely assessment and often uses fewer resources. Social impact measurement is a new and exciting emerging field of practice. Evaluation, on the other hand, is more rigorous and can be more resource intensive. It often involves complex assessments and uses detailed frameworks to build an evidence base. Evaluation is a better, well-established practice. It's been around for a lot longer than social impact measurement. So within the work we do, there are some elements that are likely to be distinctly social impact measurement and some that are distinctly evaluation. But there's also a lot of overlap. And I think we can think of these two concepts as more of a spectrum rather than a distinct set of practices. We also know that this is true of the members of each society. So some of you are members of both SIMNA and AES. So there's clearly overlap in the types of work you engage in and the ideas that you subscribe to. Another thought I wanted to raise is designing for purpose. Designing for purpose is essential for every evaluator or social impact measurer. Each program and policy is very different, and they serve different people, contexts, needs, and have different timeframes and resources associated with them. The same is also true for assessment of these programs. So there are pros and cons to both ends of the spectrum of social impact measurement and evaluation. For example, in the extreme, on the evaluation side of the scale, it's not always practical or appropriate to conduct a robust randomized control trial evaluation. This may not deliver the best results for the context or for the people involved. On the other hand, on the social impact measurement end of the scale, a simple measurement that delivers practical insights ready for timely implementation as a program is delivered may not satisfy those seeking to make low-risk decisions or maintain program fidelity and continuity over the life of a program. As a consultant, I seek to ensure that my work reflects these differences in purpose and that it is fit for purpose, whatever that purpose may be. So if the cultures are a continuum, then the big question becomes, how can we learn from each other and spread the importance of the work that we do? So there's been a push in recent years to bring more accountability into programs and policies across governments, nonprofits, and the private sector. And this has led to more evaluation units and teams seeking to work with and alongside program delivery and policy. However, these evaluation units can face challenges working with the organisation and demonstrating their usefulness. They're often engaged late in the life of the program and can be perceived negatively as critical assessors. So one of the big challenges that I've come across in my work are how can program designers better incorporate planning for measurement or evaluation? So this includes building in flexibility as the program evolves and including iterative learning and performance improvements over the life of the program instead of a simple end of program review. One of the other big challenges is instilling the importance of evaluation. So how can organisations support their staff to value evaluation? To understand that it's not something to be feared, but instead is something that can improve performance and drive change more quickly, efficiently, and appropriately. So the three key messages I want you to take away from the talk for discussion later on are labels important if we exist on a spectrum? It's important to design for purpose, whatever that purpose, and that progressing our work matters more than our differences. Thank you, and I'll hand over to Simon.
Thank you, Laura. That was fabulous, and I hope everyone was listening very carefully, because much of what Laura was saying, I really do want to build on. And I do want to build on it first by taking us up a level and considering who we are as professionals, who we are as individuals working in the sectors that we do, trying to make sense of whether programs are or initiatives, organisations are doing well or not. This picture is from the album cover back in the olden days when there were CDs and albums, and it's a band called Tool, and the album's called Lateralis. And it was a pretty exciting album cover for us progressive metal nerds out there. It was exciting because it was about 15 different sheets in there that showed a different system of the human body. There are multiple different systems that we have. We have skeletal systems, respiratory systems. This image also included the spiritual systems. And I just wanted to highlight this as an analogy for how we think about ourselves and our work that we do. And that there's lots of different labels that we use to describe what we do. And there's different components of the different facets of the work, either in evaluation or in social impact measurement. And that then means, and just first of all, full credit to Fresh Spectrum, who has a collection of the most amazing evaluation cartoons out there. It's sensational. But this then means that when people ask a question like, what is an evaluation? Everything can fall under the banner of what evaluation may be. And I'm using evaluation as the example here because it is a more established profession and identity. So there's quite broad, and when we're thinking about evaluation, social impact measurement, the different what's considered underneath it and how it's applied, there's going to be a lot of similarities, is what Laura was pointing to before. So what is an evaluation? One other thing to add with what is an evaluation, I vividly remember when I first learned about developmental evaluation, I started doing that work. I'm like, is this evaluation? Really? How is this evaluation? Am I just working with the client like I would? My background's more in management consulting, strategy consulting. And so I'm like, this makes sense to me. This isn't what I anticipated it to be, and quite different to other evaluation projects I'd worked on. So many things can fall under the banner of evaluation, and similarly with social impact measurement. What both of those labels refer to, again, just thinking about it at that aggregate level, is we have three concepts that we really need to understand carefully and consider them to know what we are trying to achieve with respect to the scope of work. So first is around knowing who your social impact measurement or evaluation is for, the audience. The purpose, why are we doing it? can vary greatly for both evaluation and social impact measurement. And then the rigor, which is how far do you need to go to get a meaningful answer? Now, Laura pointed to an important point that's generally true with evaluations, that it often points towards something which is more rigorous, and with social impact measurement, often it could be considered less rigorous, which relates back to the purpose and the audience. What I'd like to highlight is that there are going to be some situations where the rigor has to be incredibly high with social impact measurement, particularly if it's for an investment and there's money associated with a payment by result contract or a social impact bond. So just want us all to hold these three concepts as we're considering the similarities and differences, because they apply to both. And by the way, this is also why these presentations that Laura and I are giving and what we're going to discuss isn't all about different methods and approaches. There's a lot of similarities between what you could do for social impact measurement and what you could do for evaluation. One of the things that could be a difference between social impact measurement community and identity and the evaluation community and identity is how we approach problems. Laura highlighted before that there's a lot of similarities in what we're likely to do, the skills in critical thinking, an analytical approach at different points in time, working out what the right boundaries are and pushing some of that, the thinking for what's going to hopefully create a better world. But this, I quite like this cartoon, particularly some of you may be able to see the background that I have here. I've got 3 daughters, and through lockdowns, 200 plus days and 18 months of lockdowns here in Melbourne, there's a lot of pictures on the wall. And I do get this question quite often, you know, Daddy, do you like my picture? And there are some caricatures or stereotypes of evaluators, which might have a response like, well, if you'd like to be objective, I'd have to create a rubric. One thing that I'll always go back to is the purpose. If my purpose is I want to make my child feel loved, and the audience is just her, and then the rigor might just be very little to nothing when it comes to actually assessing what the picture might look like. And there's 2 pictures I want to share here, 2 cartoons again from Fresh Spectrum that I wanted to share, just to highlight when, you know, are we going too far? Now, this is taking dare I say, a critique of the evaluation community and the approaches that I use, but I think it can equally apply to how things are emerging with social impact measurement. So we are constrained in our works within organisations or coming into it as consultants, sort of supporting, doing work either in evaluation or social impact measurement. But we need to be very wary of things like the constraints and making sure we go back to what the use of it might look like. And similarly, it comes back to social impact measurement becoming potentially more practical, useful on a day-to-day basis in terms of the scope and how something's set up, versus an evaluation, which may be more appropriate if you're trying to get a level of independence over time. So I just want you to hold those different thinking as we continue the discussion today. And that discussion does relate to culture and identity, the identity of being an evaluator, the identity of being someone who does social impact measurement or works in social impact, the culture that's being created from the different AES and SIMNA communities. There's big questions there that we should be asking ourselves about, well, how different are they? How similar are they? And that's what we're unpacking a lot more today. The final page I wanted to share with you was just if we're talking about the communities, then, well, what are the communities? Like what describes the vision and the mission? I'm not going to read them out word for word, but I think on the left-hand side, just to highlight with the AES, it's a sign of a professional discipline that's been developed over time and has a strong, solid, dare I say, identity that's been established. On the right-hand side, you can see with SIMNA, it's much more, it's evolved recently. This is something which is new. So we established SIMNA as a non-profit in 2016. It's a membership organisation. So this is a point where it's like, well, what are we trying to do? We're trying to bring different people together who don't often talk about measurement and evaluation. So hence, different description for the vision and the purpose. For SIMNA, I might pause there. It's enough of the presentation. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and ask Laura. Laura, we had a bit of a chance to talk yesterday about this, and from that discussion and what I've shared, is there anything that sort of prompts a question from you?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things you raised, Simon, is this concept of identities and cultures, and I think this is something we both touched on, in that social impact measurement is very much that new and exciting thing. It's emerged in the last few years, and it's really taken hold across a number of areas and is delivering really good results for a number of sectors. I'm curious to hear a little bit more about why you think that that culture or that identity developed and the niche that it thrives in.
Great, challenging question. By the way, just to share with everyone, we haven't worked out what the questions are going to be for each other, so this is legitimately riffing off each other. It should be pretty interesting where we go. So the reason why social impact measurement evolved, it did stem from the broader social return on investment thinking, which had a stronger relationship to the private sector and investment in creating social change. How that evolved over time, though, was to be able to say there's a professional discipline like evaluation, but also other professional disciplines like accounting, and there's something in the middle. So for SIMNA, for example, the SIMNA community, there are some people who are accountants. There are some people who are more evaluators. And there are some people who are working in operations, but they're coming together because there's this different thing. There's this thing about understanding on a day-to-day basis what the changes may be. So more of a practical lens and less of that sort of defined professional pathway that's associated with it. And there's just one more point I will add. There's been attempts, and we're continuing that with Social Value International, to develop practitioner pathways for accredited social value and SROI identities over time. So that's something that has begun to change, but it's not nearly as developed as the evaluator identity and culture that's sort of been set across the world.
Completely agree. And I think that's something we touched on yesterday as well, in that evaluation is well established, does have professional pathways to develop skills and professional qualifications in evaluation. And that's one of the differences now between the two fields. But as you say, it's likely to change in coming years as social impact measurement is more highly valued. One of the other points I wanted to pick up on your talk was the idea or the notion of independence and working collaboratively with a client and with a community. What do you see as the differences between social impact measurement and evaluation in terms of being able to get stuck in and work with people to find a collaboratively to find an answer versus having that arm's length approach, which is what I'd associate more with evaluation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think I don't think there's a difference. And I want to qualify that by saying that the difference comes in answering the questions about purpose, audience, and rigor. So you can use different approaches around evaluation, which is necessarily at a point in time. It might be working to that point in time versus more of a mindset of we're going to be collecting information, measuring the changes in a more of an ongoing manner. So I think that the independence, the timeframes, all of that sort of sits underneath the holy trinity of purpose, audience, and rigor. And it might also shift. I found that some of my day job at Social Ventures, my evaluation clients, often government departments, are sort of framed as an evaluation, but we end up working very closely with them. So we're sort of got these iterations around purpose, audience, and rigor to make sure that, oh, look, the policy changed. Well, that was a 3-year evaluation, so we have to change everything now. So it needs to be iterative and moving over time. So I see there's a lot more convergence on that level, and that independence may be for some evaluators very strong as a part of that purpose of why we're doing it. We need an independent assessment. But that, in a lot of the work that I've done, that is a part of it, but it's not the biggest part of it.
And so it seems to be my assessment of both of our talks is that it's more about that fit for purpose and that rigor audience purpose that you brought up as well. Is that just our perceptions, or how do clients perceive us, or how do clients perceive you? What do you get asked to do?
It's a great question. I want to answer that first, and I'd love to hear your perception on or answer that question too. I think that the label of an evaluator is strong, and so often many of my clients perceive the work that I do as evaluation, and I am the evaluator. So that's stronger than social impact measurement. One thing that has come through is that you are the social impact measurement professional. So particularly with the private sector, that's often the term that's used. It's not so much social impact, social measurement, but much more around that impact word sort of being highlighted. This is what we're interested in, social impact. I'm interested in what you think about that, Laura.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I agree. It doesn't seem to be around social measurement. It's around impact, and that impact can be social, it can be environmental, it can be economic. Depends what kind of area you're looking at. I feel the way that I'm approached as a consultant from my clients, which tend to be government, is in that evaluation space. I don't get many clients coming and saying, we want to do a social impact measurement. They say, we want to do an evaluation, which happens to touch on social issues. And so I wonder if it's because evaluation is longer standing, it has a more established brand, if you like, or identity, and that governments may not have caught up with the social impact term or emerging exciting field that it is.
And Laura, maybe you've hit on something that we didn't even get to yesterday, which is why doing things twice is always great. But maybe the difference is a breadth in evaluation, which can encompass evaluating components that are part of the means or the operations and how things work. Whereas social impact measurement is focused more at that pointy end of, have we made a difference in the community, in society, for a group of people? And that may also be where there's that distinction of focus, which comes back to the purpose of what we're trying to achieve with the work we're doing. And that probably also points to, within the evaluation world, the word monitoring is often used. M&E, monitoring and evaluation. Sometimes you can hear it flipped to, M&E's measurement and evaluation. Now, because they're flipping, that for me is an interesting indicator. And your question up front are labels important? They are important. And I think maybe there's some confusion from the mindset of people who are paying for this work, or lay people within your organizations who I need an M&E specialist. You say, well, what does the M stand for? And what do you mean? And do you actually know what evaluation encompasses? And how does that relate to this social impact measurement thing? So that's where I think there is, it's not, their labels are not well defined, clear to the market more broadly and in the way that we work.
No, I'd completely agree with that. And I think one of the other really interesting points is I often get reviews that have evaluation frameworks. So there's this blurring of what these terms mean. And so I think that's the really important focus of any project, is sitting down with who you're doing it with and saying, what are we actually looking for here? We may call it evaluation, you might call it social impact measurement. Is it in fact the same thing? Let's make sure we're clear at the outset, because otherwise we're going to end up with different answers based on our biases of what a word means.
So the challenge with some of that is many pieces of work are defined by someone and then shared for a response. And so it's implied. So yes, that would be nice, but a lot of the time it's a competitive process and something's being defined and then shared. And the objectivity, particularly with government panels, means that you can't have that discussion, which makes it more difficult. So yes, for some situations, and particularly there's been definitely a change over the last 5 years with impact roles, so director of impact within an organisation. Now that pertains more to social impact measurement than evaluation, and pushes back on strategy, like what do we want to do overtly. But that's within sort of the constraints of an organisation thinking through what's happening, versus something which has more of that. We need someone to come in from the outside to support, sometimes with that independence. So you can't have that discussion until you're in there and you're trying to do that work.
No, exactly. And then it's up to you to pick up the pieces or to figure out what it is that you're actually working on.
Yeah.
Agree. Well, it's just hit one. So we might switch over to asking some questions on Mentimeter polling software. So Francesca's just put the link in the chat. If you could all click on the link, we've got just a couple of questions to start to promote some discussion across the group. We're really keen to hear kind of what your feedback is as a whole. Great, thank you for sharing that. Okay, and so what does the first question look like? So this question aims to understand, where do you think you work? Is it in social impact measurement, evaluation, both or neither? So I think this gets to my kind of Venn diagram question at the beginning of, you know, what do you call yourself? So really interesting that we can see a lot of people here are both. Also a lot of neither. I'm curious to hear what the neithers would consider themselves as. If anyone wants to type in the chat.
And while you're putting it into chat, it's important to note that the question is about, do we work in that space versus how you identify? Because I don't call myself, for example, a social impact measurer. In fact, I don't know anyone who calls himself a social impact measurer. So and that's where I think that the point I was trying to make about identity sort of comes to the fore, where there is an evaluator identity, for better or worse. It's strong. There are characteristics associated, but that's not the same yet with this emerging field around social impact measurement.
And interesting, a few neithers coming through. So kind of on that three. So we've got some CEOs, heads of companies, also people working to use the findings of social impact measurement, or working and planning those. And so a lot of policy as well. And venture capital, very interesting to see the range of people that are represented here.
And I think that's what's shifted over time. So within the domain of the private sector, private equity, venture capital, the world of evaluation lingers, but social impact measurement has come to the fore. And that is an important part of the positioning of the for-purpose investments.
Right, so maybe if we move on to the next question. So are social impact measurement and evaluation the same thing? So a lot of overlap. This is really interesting to see. And I think, Simon, if I speak for both of us, we'd argue the same thing.
Well, I think that's encouraging. I think that's why we've got this joint webinar today. It's like there is overlap. And that's why we didn't also go into all of the methods and approaches that we both would use in our work, because depending on, and I will go back to the purpose, audience and rigor, sorry, but that's all I've got in my career. But with those three, there is that overlap of, well, what are we trying to do here? Who is it for? And how far do we go? And I've just got one more point. There was a point before about scientific rigor. And I think that's a problem with the label rigor. Sometimes it does have that association that rigor necessarily means a high level of rigor, scientific rigor, but rigor does not have to mean that. Hence trying to have that description around it getting to a meaningful answer, and therefore it can apply to social impact measurement and evaluation. Sorry, Laura.
Oh, I was going to say that one of the interesting notions that came up yesterday is, instead of purpose as in what is a project for in terms of a client or a community, more saying what is the purpose of the work that we do more broadly. And I think broadly yesterday, people were saying that they work in this space because they want to create change and they want to bring more accountability to the way that programs are delivered to make better social outcomes. So thinking that one level higher, there's a lot more overlap as well. Great. So maybe moving on to the third question. We were excited to see the responses for this one. So this is the word cloud. What's one word that best describes what we can learn from each other?
Keep adding the words. We've got 61. Keep it on growing. We know how many people are on the call right now because this is discipline across both social impact measurement and evaluation. We need a good sample size to be able to see what the results are.
And at least half of you are hanging back at the moment, so don't be shy. Feel free to enter. It's anonymous. Really interesting to see flexibility, collaboration, and purpose coming through there. And I think that resonates with what we've both said, saying we need to be adaptable as providers of these services or as people who collaborate with those that provide these services.
Indeed.
Make sure that it's fit for purpose.
Perhaps that word purpose, let's unpack that a little bit more. Is it because it's for purpose? Is it for a purpose? That word could mean a few different things. If anyone's feeling confident to pop something in the chat to try to explain further what you meant by purpose when you're putting it in there.
And just to fence it here, I'd say it would be a bit of both.
Okay. Yeah.
It would be saying, or I would like to feel that my work has purpose and that I achieve change. And I think that's one of the core reasons why I do what I do. But also that individual projects have a specific purpose and objective they're trying to achieve. So a bit of both, but keen to hear what others say as well. Interesting to see flexibility and collaboration at the centre because it's implied when we are working with others and trying to work out where they're coming from, a different cultural lens, a different way of approaching it. I think it's quite important to be able to have that flexibility and openness to appreciative inquiry, understanding what's going on. Listening, that's another one that's coming up just a little bit lower than those top three. Okay. Listening, change, technology. I think those are really interesting as well. And I think they fit into needing to be flexible and needing to collaborate. Okay. Great. And maybe on to the last question. So do evaluators use the same skill sets as professionals doing social impact measurement? So yes, and there's some overlap. Some overlaps coming up quite highly. And as Simon said, that's why we didn't delve too much into what all the different techniques and methods and approaches are, because there's likely to be a lot of similarities, but it's also likely to highlight some of the differences as well, I think. Indeed. Great. Well, maybe we some of the questions. So we can see that you've been popping a lot in the chat. But it'd be great to hear some of those come through. So I might hand over to Paula to start asking some of those.
Yeah, thank you very much. There has been a few questions coming up, so I hope we can address all of them, but if not, and then if someone wants to stay a bit longer as well. So I just collated some here, and then if you have more, just please put in the chat. So someone mentioned in the academic accounting management literatures, there are many more labels. So outcome measurement, impact measurement, output measurement, input measurement, and etc. So also measurement can be at multiple levels, program, organizations, and system. So can you comment on that? Yeah, there's another question, maybe related, but maybe just start with that. See how you go.
You like to, Laura?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, really good question. I think, again, it comes down to being able to develop an approach that suits the need of the program or suits the need of the situation, the client, the community that you're working with. I think outcomes, and impacts all have different meanings, and they relate to various stages of what's achieved by a program or a policy. And so it's important to understand what you're trying to measure. I think also at that multiple levels, again, it really depends on what you're trying to measure. So whether you're delivering a small program or a discrete program or whether it's a series of programs delivered under a banner of a policy. You might want to understand how that policy works. And to do that, you need to understand how each individual program works and what its effect has been. So again, it's very much going to be what's the context and what are we trying to get out of this?
And I want to add something. It's a different angle to that. That makes perfect sense, Laura. It's just about what we can control. My background, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, was philosophy. And I can't help but go back to language and how we can control language or can't control language. And so with all these different labels, there's going to be a community, a group, and sometimes they're small and vocal. Sometimes they might be very large but quiet, and just how they're using those terms. So often the battle we have is always just taking a step back and appreciating that we all have a different understanding of the words that we are using. Now, often they're very similar. Sometimes there's convergence over time as we all understand what that word refers to, but there's also different contexts where it's being used and different intents behind it. So I think it's just a reminder of the complexity of language and the labels that are used.
Right. And just one more note while Paula finds the next question. On that program organization system level, I find that's often tied to funding. So often funding might have been allocated to one program or to 5 programs under a policy banner. And so how that funding has been organised and provided to deliver activities is generally how is the scope of the evaluation.
Okay, thank you. Another question here. I'm also really interested in the fallback position of scientific rigor as being able to deliver independence and the need to question the power involved in the position of the evaluator. Any comments on that? Views?
I think you touched on this earlier, Simon, as well, about the scientific rigor.
Yeah, I do think it's an important word in that question around power. And it's something that does come up often with an evaluator identity and having the power to make the judgments. So who has the power to make a professional judgment, which relates also to what we've been touching on around the independence. But it does come back to how we interpret the word rigor and what's going to be appropriate depending on who it's for and why we're doing it. But I think it's a really astute observation.
Okay, so another question here. So presenters noted social impact measurement might be less resource intensive than evaluation. So if you could just elaborate on that. And there's another question as well, it's similar. How can we balance the tension between measuring impacts or outcomes in short timeframes? Part of the appeal of social impact measurement seems to be the potential to get more responsive information in a timely manner. So maybe if you just touch the resource intensive, what was mentioned in the presentation.
Yeah, good question. I'm happy to have a first stab at that. So in terms of resources that are input into evaluation or social impact measurement, I think it's really important, again, to understand what it is you're trying to achieve, the level of rigor you need to achieve, how long you have to deliver an evaluation or to deliver a social impact measurement, and what kind of confidence a decision maker needs to make a decision. So often I find that where the decision maker wants a lot of confidence and a low risk threshold to make a decision, then often the evaluations, I do have a lot more resources invested in them to add new data collection methods or triangulate information that's being collected through the evaluation to make sure that the findings are more robust, for another word. Often that takes longer. It takes more time, it takes more people hours, takes more funding. So it can be more resource intensive. I'm sure that also occurs under social impact measurement, and there's a scale on how many resources are used to conduct different projects as well. So it comes down to fitness for purpose. Simon, did you want to comment on that?
Just popped in the chat, enough precision for the decision.
Exactly.
So that's at the core of this. If someone's giving you money on the back of the measurement, going to have to be pretty precise, particularly if it's a large amount of money. Just back to that point around purpose, audience, rigor, what's enough to make the decision, how does it relate to those three? That's where I do go. And that's where there's often variables. So I don't agree that social impact measurement is less resource intensive necessarily. It can often be because of what we're trying to achieve to make changes sooner, often, than an evaluation approach.
But just as we were talking about earlier, there's a difference between how you might engage people using different methods, and sometimes in-depth stakeholder engagement can be very expensive, and yet that might be the best way to come to an answer. So if you're taking a more engagement-based approach, it might not be cheaper or less resource intensive.
Yeah, there's also a question here in regards to balancing the tension between measuring impacts or outcomes in short timeframes. And the person's mentioned that the part of the appeal of social impact measurement seems to be the potential to get more responsive information in a timely manner. Is that the case?
So I might try that first of all. I think the trend is yes. That's what's been attractive about the social impact measurement emerging profession, is to be able to try to get answers quicker and be more responsive. And that relates back to being clear about what you're trying to achieve and making faster decisions on that information, so faster feedback loops. But it doesn't discount that some evaluations, particularly developmental evaluation approaches, and even with some realist evaluation approaches, you're trying to get information faster to be able to make decisions in the nearer term for new or innovative programs, or even for more established programs. There's a pending decision and you need to use that information now. So that's where I do see more convergence between these two worlds, and going back to, well, what are we trying to achieve? But on the whole, because there's more people coming without a technical background to the social impact measurement world, it's pushed much more towards being more responsive, less rigor generally.
I think just to add to that, I think a lot of the evaluations I do, particularly in the science and research and development space, where the lead times to outcomes and impacts can be very long. Often we look at lead indicators of that success, and often those lead indicators are more qualitative than quantitative, because there is no kind of hard quantitative data for how well a program is doing after a year or two. That might take 10 years to develop. So it's being balanced, the types of data you're...
But the lead indicators, if we're looking about generational changes, I've been fortunate to work with some communities where the view is to be able to see a generational change. And so if we're looking at a generational change or a couple of generations, then what we need to be able to do is understand, well, what are the indicators earlier on? Now, whether that's an evaluation that's required after 1 year, 3 years, 8 years, versus we're doing some monitoring work, or we're doing some ongoing measurement work, or whether we're having a point in time where we're doing a social impact assessment around that. That's where I think they're very similar in the approaches when we're considering, we're basically trying to work out, have we done it well? What can we do differently? They're the two. Like they're sort of the two fundamental questions at play.
Exactly. And I think all too often we have, or I encounter, the big lofty goals of what we're trying to achieve in those long-term timeframes. And it's really exciting. And I think there's a huge need to drive ambition and drive motivation towards those lofty goals. But at the same time, you need to understand what the steps are that help you get that way. So you can tick off and saying, we are on track to achieve that in 10 years' time. And I don't find there's often as much thought put into those lead indicators of success, rather than just saying, this is where we want to be in 10 years' time. So it does make it a little bit challenging to then come in and say, get there or not.
Okay, so another question, do you think there is more interest from the corporate sector to measure the impact they're making in the wider community? Is the community any better as a result of our investment? Beyond the financial returns,
I can answer that. I think it's a definitive yes. There is definitely more interest. The overall, the level of rigor is low in terms of their expectations, and the legislative or shareholder push for very good social impact measurement, social impact assessments, or environmental assessments around that. It's changing, and definitely better than what it was a decade ago. But there's definitely a lot more happening now. And in particular, even in the last 2 years, through the types of projects, some of you may have heard of the impact management projects, where we're looking at the trillions of dollars of investments at a global level, and where they go finding the standards to be able to make sure that investors are creating positive social and environmental change. That wasn't a decade ago. Much more about that now. We'll talk about that for a few days.
Definitely. I think we're seeing much more of a push from the private sector saying government may not be driving this hard enough. We need to step in and help so that we can create change for the future. So I completely agree with that.
Okay, another question is someone that is in a new role. So the person said, I'm interested in establishing boundaries where there is overlap between the two roles and how to work together. So where to start? Begin with social impact measurement and then plan evaluations? Are we internal customers for each other's aims? Are there evaluation activities that are not about measuring social outcomes? So this person is starting a new role, so that some good tips there that you both can provide.
So I'll jump in first. My tip would be forget about the labels. One of Laura's questions up front of, are labels important? Yes. So make sure you're clear about what you want to achieve. So that's the purpose. Who is it for? And then the rigor, how far you go to get a meaningful answer. That then will allow you to say, okay, there's some measurement activities. Some of them pertain more to traditional evaluation type of approaches. Some of them might be more of the investment or social impact measurement type of approaches. So I would be elevating it to that holy trinity first. And that way you can get clear about which way you go.
And I'd say those two roles should be sitting right next to each other and working very closely together. I wouldn't see a distinction necessarily in what you're trying to do unless you decide to break up tasks. But certainly I would have thought that the overall purpose would have been to find meaning in the organization's work and try to achieve progress for the organization. So working together would be my first step.
Okay. Another question here for both of you. Do you think because social impact is newer, harder to describe and measure, that industry perceives evaluation as more reliable? So is that a perception? So the person said, I also think traditionally evaluation comes at the end rather than impact measurement, which may allow for measurement during a project. So is it a perception that maybe it's new and that's harder to describe and measure than industry perceives evaluation as more reliable?
Laura?
I'll have a start. Yeah, that would be my perception, rightly or wrongly, that my comment would be that there is a perception that rightly or wrongly evaluation is considered to be more reliable and more well established. It is a much longer standing field of work, as Simon said. So I think there is a tendency to go to it, or at least with the clients I work with that tend to be government, to use evaluation rather than social impact measurement. And as I said, social impacts are considered as part of the evaluation, but that's just a label. So I think it's a familiar label and it's one that they know how to use, so they use it, rather than it being a difference in the purpose of the work.
Also, just to add that we as professionals, individuals, often straddle these worlds and other worlds too. It's not, my own identity is not just within the social impact measurement world and evaluation world. I overtly work within strategy and making sure they're working out where you want to go. So we've got to remember that people who are making decisions about what work to have done often sort of come at it from many, many different angles. And so we as individuals will be applying different tools, and the worlds of evaluation and the worlds of social impact measurement, they have a perception, but then there's individuals who are applying that and bringing different perspectives to the table as and when required. So I think the simple answer to the question is probably, but there's a lot more complexity underlying that in terms of how individuals and professionals interact with the skills and tools that they have.
Okay, I have 2 more questions. So one that just came up. So what role does transparency, accessibility, and data sovereignty play in navigating social impact versus evaluation?
Transparency, accessibility. So I think it plays a central role back to the purpose of what you're trying to achieve, and power. So calling out power as a part of, in particular, data sovereignty, and knowing who has access to the data, who owns the data, who can inform what the data is. I don't know if there is necessarily a difference between the worlds of social impact measurement and evaluation. I see conceptually that they're being quite similar in the approach, and both, all those different concepts are critical part of navigating what you're trying to achieve.
I think picking up on that transparency element as well, I think it's transparency with who. And something that Simon and I have talked about is that a lot of our work isn't necessarily public. So maybe it's being transparent with the client or with stakeholders that you're working with, but that information may not enter the public domain. So there's got to be some consideration of intellectual property and confidentiality and security, but also elements of transparency. So I think, again, it comes down to who, transparency with who, and making sure that that's tailored.
Great. So last question. So someone would like your thoughts on this two community creating or becoming more cooperatively or cooperating in the future.
So is that about us cooperating more?
Yeah.
Or becoming a cooperative?
Becoming a cooperative.
Yes.
As in the legal structure of a cooperative?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Who asked you?
So having...
Yes, Simon. Yes, that's exactly what I'm asking. Has there been any thoughts or considerations in and around creating a cooperative environment, literally a cooperative structure?
Well, SIMNA is a membership organisation, and the members have the rights to vote for directors and see what direction, support the direction of the organisation. So I'm a SIMNA member to have that say. I'm not sure of the legal structure of AES, but
dictatorship.
Sorry, it's membership as well, isn't it?
Dictatorship.
Dictatorship, and is that Greg at the helm?
No, it's actually a company structure, I understand.
So yeah, I mean, SIMNA is a company limited by guarantee with a social purpose with members. To move to a cooperative between both organisations would be a significant move, and just appreciating the governance complexities already at play in a COVID world, I personally would struggle as chair of SIMNA to try to push that through at this point in time. I can understand and the desire for different legal structures and the benefits of a cooperative structure, but that's a fairly significant shift.
But there's certainly no reason why we couldn't do more collaborative events. And there certainly seems to be a lot of overlap in the work that we do. And I imagine there'll be a few of you looking to join AES or join SIMNA after today. So there's certainly things that we can work together on and learn from each other on.
All right, well, we come to an end, so it's 1:30. Thank you very much for everyone that participated in this event with the two communities. We think it was a really great success, and then it was great opportunity to have all this dialogue, engagement, and all those questions. Also, thank you, Simon and Laura, for leading the dialogue, developing the presentation, answering all these really curly questions that came up, and being available for 2 days. So, because this event has run for 2 days. So it's thank you very much for taking the time, 2 days running. My key takeaways from this presentation is the social impact measurement evaluation are both discipline agnostic. They have overlaps, but they use slightly different words. Both involve critical thinking, compile evidence to make judgments and bring accountability. So social impact measurement is an emerging field of practice, and evaluation is well established, with evaluation attracting people from different parts. And the key difference between those two communities is a cultural difference and labels they're using. So thank you very much. Your feedback is much appreciated, so we can run those sort of like webinars again in the future. And so we'll send a survey will be with you in your inbox. And if you can just give your feedback, what's the preferred time, what sort of topic you want to hear. And if you have time and if you'd like to ask more questions, we're opening this session for another 50 minutes. So you can just you can unmute yourself and ask the presenter's direction and directing, and then have a conversation until 1:45. Okay, well, thank you very much.